God puts us in nations, in places, not by mistake, but to do a job. What if we opened our eyes to the needs of our colleagues, of our leaders, of our subordinates, and we were a priest on their behalf? Welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. My name is Brett Johnson.
And I'm Lynn Johnson.
And we're going to be talking about how to get our business into God's business. Our subtext is Let My Business Go, and we'll have guests from around the world. So thank you for joining us this week and every week on the Repurposing Business Podcast. Well, welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. We're in the series When Capital Meets Eternity, and I'm delighted today to have Pieter Faure from South Africa, who is with me, and for taking the time. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Brett. It's a privilege to be on the call with you today.
Yeah, and Pieter and I have a few things in common, apart from both being South Africans, but we ended up spending time at what is now PwC. I see that Pieter was articled there and spent some time there. How long were you with them, Pieter?
I was there for 7 years. I didn't go through the normal article route. I started as a consultant with a legal background. And I guess pretty soon I realized that being at an accounting firm, I either have to become an accountant or find a new course of employment. And so I changed course and transitioned to the internship program, the articles program, completed my articles there, and then spent some time, a good 3 or 4 years in the corporate tax department, where we looked at structuring transactions for businesses, etc.
Yeah, well, PwC is a good training ground for all sorts of things, but I ended up having 14 years with them, but it was almost multiple careers within the time. The last 4 of them were in San Francisco. So yeah, it's a great company. And so how did you journey from there, Pieter? Where did you go after that?
So I joined PwC in 97, and by about 2003 thereabouts, I really started feeling I guess a little bit of a restlessness around the journey that I was on. I was starting to feel a sense that I needed to trust God and have an expectation that He could do the unexpected in my life. And the more I was thinking about this, I realized for God to truly do that for me, in terms of what He had in store for me, I needed to step out into a more entrepreneurial space where I embraced some uncertainty, which up to that stage probably wasn't quite my nature, but at the same time created room for God just to do things that I could never have envisaged. And I guess looking back, that was a really pivotal moment on my journey, because it was during that time where I really connected with Francois van Niekerk and the Mergon group, at that stage more through the technology company Infotech.
Yeah.
And Francois, I was sort of I guess on the rise at PwC. I had a wife that was pregnant. We had just bought a house, and I got this phone call to say that, listen, we have a job, but it's a half-day job. We can't afford a full-day position at the moment, and you need to decide whether this is something you're interested in. And so I went back to my wife, and we were thinking through this and started praying about it. And after some time of prayer, I said to her, listen, I really feel that whatever we need to do, this is something from God. And whether that means selling and going and back and living in an apartment, whatever that is, but we need to be obedient. This is a door that God has opened. And she was with me. She said, whatever it takes, we're going to make this transition. And and so there my journey with Francois and with the Mergon group started.
What a fantastic story, and what a good wife. You know, but it's also important to be able to have heard God's voice in a big decision like that. And I met a guy, a Jewish guy once in New York City who was a school teacher, but he became a believer. And he said to me, you have to put yourself in a position where God can bless you, which is often a position of risk. So, and that takes a risk, but if you stay in the safe thing, you almost tie God's hands in terms of his ability to bless you. So fantastic, Peter. That sounds great. So you moved part-time to Mergon, and now you're the CEO. So in between, it's been a journey. Perhaps you can just unpack a little for those who aren't familiar, because the Mergon story is a fantastic story. And I'd like to hear a bit about the journey. We'll recommend Francois's book and get that into the notes so that people can get that book. It's an excellent read and a wonderful story, wonderful faith. And then I'd like to also hear about how the Mergon group has been structured as well, so that this isn't just, oh, yeah, we want to do good stuff, but you've actually put it into practice. Perhaps you can unpack that for us.
Well, it's I guess, a mouthful. And so you need to guide me as we go along, please, Brett. And if I get stuck in detail, please move me along. But yeah, my story linked up with the Mergon story and Francois' story in 2005. But the story really started a good 25 years ago in 1980. And in fact, one could even trace it another sort of number of years ago to the early 50s, where Francois read a book by an American guy named Letourneau, who had written a book on how he had been challenged to give some of the profits, and his wife challenged him. He decided to make a 10% gift and of his profits in his business when it was going tough, and his wife challenged him and said, no, you need to turn that around and make it a 90% gift. And so Francois read that story when he was a youngster, and I mean, who knows how that book ended up in the countryside in the Western Cape of South Africa. But that was something he often tells me that he remembers vividly, and had a profound influence that came through later in life. So Francois was a 40-year-old businessman. He or corporate employee, and he'd made a decision to resign from his corporate job and join and start his own little business, having had no prior sort of entrepreneurship experience and business experience. This was a really big step for him, and that was in 1980. And within a few months, he got to a point where the little bit of money that he had built up actually was running out rapidly. He had no real clients or substance, and he realized that sort of he's now at the end of the line. And he was walking to go and see, sort of in the Midtown Pretoria, to go and see a client, a prospective client that already had said, listen, I'm not doing business with you now. And he just stopped on the way to the meeting, and he prayed and he said, God, if you will give me a breakthrough, I will give 30% of this business to serve your kingdom, to advance your kingdom. And he walked from there, and literally within a couple of minutes, he walked into this office, and as he sat down, he realized that, hey, I've got a plan. Here's a thought. Why don't we structure a transaction like this? And it was literally a bolt out of the blue. He had never thought of it like that. And the guy said, that's a great idea. And that was sort of the turning moment for his little venture to survival and later flourishing. And so from there, Francois built up a technology business through some really interesting times in South Africa, some very challenging times with apartheid and with international sanctions. And there are many stories that he can share from that time. But eventually he turned his attention into property, and he started a property company or real estate company focusing on commercial real estate development. And this company ended up becoming probably one of the foremost and most successful property development companies in South Africa. And that really was a catalyst to establish a significant balance sheet or a base from which Mergon was able to launch later on. Going back a little bit just to the establishment of Mergon, shortly after this breakthrough moment, Francois realized that he had to make good on his commitment. And so he established a trust, and the mission of the trust was to expand God's kingdom. And he transferred 30% of the shares in his business into this trust. This was a starting point, and as the business became more successful over the years, he actually ended up increasing this to 70% and effectively turning around the day one 30-70 commitment to the other way. And so that was Francois' journey. And where our paths intersected in 2005, I often look back and I think, I almost marvel at the fact that Francois laid foundations for 25 years so that when the day came to start, I guess, growing and becoming more expansive on those foundations, there was such an amazing base for that to happen from. And, you know, we often think if we've done something for 5 or 10 years, that's a long time, but it really was a 25-year incubation for what Mergon today is. And over the last sort of 15, 16 years, we've seen this incredible flourishing and growth into different things of the Mergon Group and what the group had become today. Maybe
that's an encouragement, that long incubation thing, because we think, particularly if you've got a traditional investment mindset, you're thinking about a 3-year or 5-year exit. 10 years is forever to have capital tied up in something, but to build foundations for 25 years gives a sense of God's time horizon, which is wonderful. Yeah. And it's an encouragement to me because we've been going for 25 years. So maybe we can get out of the blocks now.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, along the journey, there were a couple of pivotal moments. I've mentioned sort of Francois' transition into real estate in the early 90s, which was a time of great uncertainty in South Africa. And it took real courage to actually make the decision to invest in real estate, and it reaped dividends. And so another big pivotal moment, and I guess where it sort of impacted on my journey, was around 2007. So I started in 2005 and in Infotech, which was the technology business, but my heart was quite quickly drawn to Mergon and what was starting to happen there. And I quickly realized that there was an opportunity to partner with Francois on this journey, to build and work on something that God was already working on and busy with. And so we started talking, and it was a decision point in the sense that Francois was 67 years old by that stage. He had to decide, was he going to sort of end the journey in terms of being entrepreneurial and being an active businessman, and sort of start becoming more defensive and focus on the giving, as I guess many times is the case where founder entrepreneurs are involved. And as we as a board of trustees prayed through this, we had this realization that God had built Mergon to the point where it was. It was not through Francois' individual entrepreneurial brilliance. I'm sure you won't mind me saying that, because that's what he would have said. And so we had the sense that God was not finished yet, and that Francois had established more than just a balance sheet. He had also established a spiritual foundation, a foundation in terms of business ethics and approach and so on, and that we could go and build a next generation team that could take on this baton and run further with us. And that's what we did at that stage. And so we made two decisions. The one was to establish a next generation entrepreneurial team, and the second thing, to start aggressively growing the distributions from this investment portfolio for ministry impact. And you can see that was sort of a catalyst moment. The foundation had been established, and it was this transition into a next generation. And and it sort of provided the momentum for us to take this and just run with it. And Francois continued to mentor, but really made space for the team to flourish in this journey.
What I love about that, Pieter, is that, as you say, I mean, there is a huge wealth transfer from one generation to the next happening in this time. And of course, there are new people rising up, creating their own wealth. But this concept of, am I going to just try to ring fence it and preserve it and hope that it lasts? Or am I going to risk it, sow it, put it in, realizing I might win some, I might lose some? It's a fundamental mindset difference, isn't it? And we've got this notion of retirement that says, well, at that point, you're done. You know, we put Francois out to pasture. You know, he can put all the money in the thing and they can give away 5% of their assets per annum or something like that. That's quite different than the entrepreneurial thing. So I love that. And I trust that that'll be a challenge to many to think that through.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. You know, I was just thinking, I've just hit 65 years old. I don't know why we say hit 65, but there we go. And, you know, you can look back on your career and you can say, well, what have I accomplished? What's been done? And from me, I went through this last year just with COVID and having time to reflect, just thinking, well, all of that is actually just rocket fuel. It's building up of the base. It's the setting of the foundation. Some of it's going to burn and it's just going to be jettisoned when you get into space. And some of it you're going to take with you. And sometimes not even trying to make sense of all of that, but just to say it's fuel for the next stage. And how do we keep going for the next stage? I think that that's critical. So I really resonate with that. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, Brett, what's interesting is in letting go and setting up this next season, it's allowed Francois to transition into different roles. As I look back on this journey, and I see it very much from the role he's played in the lives of the organization and as a team. I said to him, you know, Francois, if I look at your journey in decades, probably the 80s was a journey of entrepreneurship. The 90s was a journey of really of deal making and transaction doing and sort of a next step. But then the 2000s was much more mentorship. And then the last decade, I said to it was almost evangelism. He was spreading the story and sharing what God has done. And if he hadn't let go in the right seasons, he would never have been able to step into that next phase. And all of these phases had been impactful in different ways.
Yeah. No, that's a big deal. That's a big deal. And the principle of letting go, which I'm sure you've had to deal with as well. There's times when if you want to do kingdom business, you have to relinquish control to the king and relinquish decisions and engage God. It's not just you don't make a decision, but you have to wrestle with God in that. But if you don't let go, then things wither. You know, they die, they shrink in your hand. And I'm sure you've seen that in successive ways as you've continued with Mergon, right? Leading the team now. The journey of trusting God isn't over, I assume.
No, and I mean, for us, I often say to the guys it's a journey of God's unfolding purpose.
Yeah.
We certainly don't have this big vision of where God is taking us, but we know we're on a mission, and it feels like God gives us a little, and as we are faithful and stay the course, at the right time, He just opens up the next season, and it's almost a challenge for me. I mean, where we started, or where I started with Mergon 15 years ago as the first employee, I remember asking Francois, "Is there enough work for one full-time employee? Do you think I'm going to be busy enough?" And every, you know, I mean, obviously there's been successive sort of moments where it's been this God unfolding the next step of this journey. And every time I feel confronted that, am I willing to take that step and continue to trust Him? And I guess overcome my own insecurities in the process, because you look at what's been established and you think, okay, God, I think I've more or less got the hang of this. I can manage this. And then something more comes onto the table and you think, wow, you know, God, will it be okay? And what if it doesn't work? It's about continually letting go of control so that God can take you into more. And I guess that's the stewardship journey in many respects.
Yeah, yeah. And with that, you have to accept God's an expansionist. And so he wants every tongue, tribe, and nation. And he gives us a small framework. And if we conquer that or look after that well, steward that well, then he automatically expands it to the next one. So we don't have to get bored following God and obeying God, certainly. Yeah. And his big plans, our big plans don't scare him, which is wonderful. Yeah, that's great. Excellent. So the group right now is the foundation is 70% owner of the different entities underneath, right? Does that lead to conflicts at all with the MDs, the CEOs, the directors who are running the operational stuff? How does that work? What's that sort of, or is everybody so aligned with the mission that that's a non-issue? How do you deal with that?
We haven't found that it's caused conflict. If anything, it has been something that's been a real source of inspiration for the business leaders that we've worked with over the years. We have businesses that are led by Christian business leaders, but we also have businesses that are led by non-Christians. And for all of them, knowing that Mergon is a shareholder in the business is something that really sort of gives a sense of purpose to the leaders and to the people working there. And so from that perspective, it's been a real positive. Where it has at times caused challenges is we've been quite upfront with businesses to say that we need to grow the distributions out of Mergon. And so we sometimes sit with this inherent conflict that businesses want to keep their capital and reinvest and grow. And we actually want to push them to make larger distributions. And so there it has at times caused conflict, although at a portfolio level, we have a fairly flexible mandate with as far as that goes. So we don't have a formula. We can manage and sort of assess what the right thing is for the business at different times. But yeah, overall, I think it's been an incredible positive for all the businesses that we've been working with.
So Pieter, let's spend a little time looking at the outflow side, because, you know, one of my passions is the fact that business is ministry and that business is a great vehicle for advancing the kingdom of God. And I think the Mergon story is just a fantastic example of that. Now, when you're making distributions, you probably have a long line around the block and then again of people who would like money. You know, there are many just wonderful NGOs, charities, churches, Christian ministries, others that are just doing fantastic work, and there's a never-ending demand there. At the same time, in the last 10, 20, 30 years, or whatever, there's been an increase of businesses run by Christians who are trying to have do the same job, you know, impact, grow the kingdom, and so forth. Has there been an internal dialogue? What's that been like about, right, how much goes to quote unquote straight charity versus stuff that might end up being more sustainable in a future generation? Has that conversation happened?
So in answering that, I probably need to go back a little bit to how we think about kingdom impact. Because if we think about kingdom impact as sort of only the work that's happening in the distribution side, then you sort of in a dichotomy where if you're not distributing, you're not having kingdom impact. And I think that's from that perspective, it's important to remind ourselves. Well, let me just take a step back. When we started 10, 15 years ago, when I started with Mergon, we was very much in a mindset that for us to have kingdom impact, we're investing and we're doing business. And when we distribute, we're having kingdom impact by funding ministries. Right. But actually, over time, our understanding and our perspective on kingdom impact has actually become, I guess, more expanded and broader, and we sort of look beyond sort of Great Commission thinking purely to look at scriptures like Colossians 1:20, which says Christ came to reconcile all things to himself, and that is reconciling relationships with him, obviously first and foremost, but also broken relationships between people, and ultimately within creation and culture, to come and restore those relationships. And so from that perspective, we've taken that and said, as a group, we are all part of the Kingdom team. We are all part of the Kingdom Impact team. And whether we are investing, whether we are doing the finance, whether you're the receptionist, or whether we are deploying capital to ministries, there is some measure of Kingdom impact. And the question is, almost like a compass needle, where's God guiding us to have more, to be more focused in different seasons? And so for us, if I sort of just maybe mention, the Kingdom impact, we can't be all things to all people. I think it's important that that one understands that we need to know that God has called all his people to help build the kingdom, and that we have one role to play, and that we have a place, but we need to discern, God, where are you calling us? And so the things we want to focus on is really to see the good news of Christ shared. We want to see people come to salvation, be discipled, and become part of communities of faith. We also want to see the poor and marginalized filled with hope in Christ, and experience dignity restored. So that's really about restoring relationships between people. And then we want to see culture transformed by people living and inspiring others to live as redemptive stewards of God entrusted resources. And so from that perspective, we look at our investment activities, we look at our ministry funding activities, and we try and discern where is God leading us to invest at that time. So if we then look at this question about sustainability, sort of on the one hand, purely investment in businesses, on the other end, purely philanthropy, if you will, and somewhere in the middle being impact investment, we've by and large focused on being resource partners to ministries that are established and are really impactful, and being resource partners to businesses that are young businesses and are growing, and are businesses that have the potential to bring redemptive solutions into the world that we live in. In the middle, we've actually not done so much, but where we've started looking more and more recently is sort of looking at how do we empower ministries to become more sustainable through funding solutions, like, for example, where there's small businesses starting up, where there's maybe key capital investments that you can make that can unlock sustainability. So we've started looking at that, but it's not been a primary area of focus for us.
Okay, great. Well, I love the fact that end-to-end doesn't matter whether you're working in one of your source companies or you're a recipient of philanthropy, you're looking at all of it is kingdom impact, which is wonderful. And I would imagine that some of your MDs and CEOs are sometimes saying, look, we're a good investment. This would produce a better return. And so that's a healthy conversation to have. Fantastic. Yeah. And so as you go forward, you're now looking well beyond South Africa.
Well, if I can go back, you made an interesting comment around that some of our MDs might say it's a time to invest, and some of our ministries might say, no, it's a time to invest. I always say the best place for us to be is where we have more opportunities to invest in that we can handle, and we've also got more opportunities for impact in the ministry side that we can handle, and we have this healthy tension that we need to manage. And from that perspective, Brett, I think it's been really significant for us to understand that we don't think in terms of giving as sort of, well, we don't think in terms of giving really. We think in terms of stewarding something that's already been given. And that's the difference between having a setup or a organization where we give from the proceeds versus like with Mergon, where it owns the asset base. Yeah. When it owns the asset base, the giving has been done. And now we're just trying to discern from God, how are you leading us in the season? Are you leading us? How are you leading us to steward what you've put into our hands? There's no tension in terms of whether the one is more kingdom or the other. We are stewarding money that's been designated for kingdom impact. And all we're trying to do is hear what God is telling us in terms of, is this a season to give more, to invest, to prune? How is he asking us to manage that? And so, yeah, we've been through an interesting season. We actually grew substantially, probably overshot in terms of the growth in the giving side. We started very small 15 years ago and really grew significantly to the point where we're now working with ministries in a number of African countries, into the Middle East. We've got a great team managing the processes and the journey, and really operating as resource partners to these ministries, much more than sort of just conduits of funding. And during COVID, we had this challenge where suddenly cash flows dried up, and we had to figure out how we're going to manage this, where dividends from especially our real estate companies stopped, and it was very challenging. And so it did confront us with this question: do we continue to give despite our cash flows drying up? If we do that, it will cause some collateral damage, I guess, to the portfolio, because you would have to realize assets at below market values, or at values that was prevailing at that time. And so it was a very interesting time for us to wrestle with this. And where we ended was to say, this was clearly for us a season of pruning somewhat in the distribution space. But at the same time, we also needed to be courageous and have faith that God will provide in order to continue funding the commitments that we had already made. And it was a really beautiful way for us to say, you have to realize you can't just go gung-ho ahead, but on the other hand, you can't just shrink back and cut back on everything. And it actually caused us to go back to all our ministry partners and say, guys, we are in a position where we are needing prayer, where things have really, the situation in the world has really impacted us. We will commit to give, but we can only give from what God provides. And on a month-to-month basis during those months, every month saying, if there's money that comes in, we will distribute that funds. And so that was a beautiful sort of time for us, out of a very painful time and very challenging, but also really a time of learning. How does this dynamic work between this dynamic interplay between a balance sheet and a capital base and the distribution from it?
Yeah, Peter, one of the things that I wish I'd understood earlier, I mean, obviously I studied accounting like you, learn the difference between capital and working capital. But when you switch into the Christian world, there's almost an expectation that you will live with a wilderness mentality, sort of hand to mouth. The manna falls and it's there, and then you trust for the next day. So you don't build a capital base. But from a stewardship perspective, from a promised land perspective, you have to steward the capital. You can't get rid of the land in a bad year. Otherwise, you'll have no land the next year. And there won't be any peaches or olives or grapes or whatever. And so this expectation that a good Christian company will almost destroy its capital base in order to keep faithful at giving is just wrong, because you have to preserve the capital. There's a good book called Money Won't Make You Rich by a guy called Sunday Adelaja, and God told him, you are worse than the unprofitable servant. He said, I'm a pastor of a church of 15,000 people. He said, yeah, but at least the unprofitable servant preserved the capital. And so God's important. So I commend you for that, because there can be pressure as a Christian. You're known to be a Christian company, owned by God, given to God. So why don't you just trust God, and you can actually put the axe to the root of the tree when you do that, rather than pruning the tree. So well done.
Yeah, thank you. That's so spot on, Brett.
Yeah, quite a fascinating journey. So here you are as we wrap up our time. And I love the fact, if you were to challenge it, if you could be standing in front of a room full of business owners who've done well, they've made some money, or they might even be earlier on in the journey, and this, at what point do I decide to make God the majority shareholder, or make this business 100% committed to building the kingdom? What challenge would you give to them? I'm putting you in the evangelist role now, which is a little hard for an accountant lawyer.
I would, I guess, a couple of challenges. I would firstly ask the question, if you are willing to give that asset base away to God, would you be willing to give away control of it as well? What do I mean by that? Would you be willing to put in place a structure that will mean that you're one of the voices in the room, but not necessarily the only voice in the room that's deciding on how that capital gets deployed when it gets deployed? Secondly, I would ask the question, are you willing to invest yourself as much as your capital on this journey? God wants us and not just our capital. And I think so many business leaders have built great businesses, but maybe then once the business is built, run the philanthropy or the impact side as a sort of a, what do we call it, a day trader investor, and it takes an equal amount of thought and commitment to build impactful giving platforms as it does to build an impactful business platform. And so that would be my one challenge. And then in terms of, I guess, investing, from an investing perspective, what's been interesting, coming back to the example of Francois not deciding to, at the end of his sort of very active entrepreneurial and business journey, sort of move into a defensive mode and actually choosing to continue to be entrepreneurial. One of the things that really surprised us over the years is how Mergon's reach and impact in the business community has grown, because it's this Christian organization, but that are fully active in the business community. And so that has led to us having interactions with people in financial institutions and in corporate and in so many different places where we may have never reached if we had just simply given the money to a fund manager and focused only on the giving side or the distribution side. And probably some of the, I came off a call yesterday, some of the most pleasing conversations that I have is to hear of people calling us and saying, hey, we want to talk to you guys because we want to, we're building a successful business, and we actually also want to give part of the capital to serve God's purposes. This Mergon has set an example, and I think we mustn't underestimate the example that people who are considering these things are setting for the broader business community, the Christian business community. And that's really what multiplication is. Multiplication isn't growing our investment returns year on year. Multiplication is seeing more people make these type of commitments to Christ. And I think that is something that we often measure sort of many things, but we don't necessarily think that is a measurable impact that we may never know the full extent of. But just like Letourneau shared his story with Francois, today there are many people that can be inspired by people like Alan Barnard, Francois, and similar stories.
Yeah, and historically, guys like Stanley Tam, I know he was way back, and when he went to try to find a lawyer that would make Jesus the majority shareholder, he had to struggle to find a lawyer who would do it.
We had the same story. We had the same story.
That's right. Yeah. So we have to kind of break the mold sometime. Pieter, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's been inspirational. Lovely to hear that. And we'll certainly put the Mergon references so people can get Francois's book. And we look forward to your book sometime when you write it. I remember years ago, I met this guy, and he was also a Price Waterhouse guy, and his wife had been to a meeting where some people in our organization were speaking, and she came home and she said to her husband, there's this ex-Price Waterhouse guy who's written a book called Convergence. You need to read it. And he said, I'm not going to read a book written by an accountant. So
no, that's true. That's true. Brett, it's been great talking to you. And yeah, I mean, if anyone would like to sort of ask more practical questions down the line, they're welcome to get in touch with us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate that. And look forward to seeing the ongoing journey. It's just wonderful. Thank you so much, Pieter.
Thank you, Brett.